Please help me welcome Anayansi Diaz-Cortes, and she's gonna talk about her podcast after Ayotzinapa, the Mexico's disappearance of the forestry. Welcome to UCLA, Anayansi.
Test 1, 2, test. So I was hoping that this would play a little bit like a conversation and it's not just so like information coming down. So I will just walk through the steps as, yes, the podcast, I'm here to present about the podcast, but it's also a platform to kind of understand this, not only story of forced disappearance, but impunity and how impunity replicates itself in Mexico specifically in this case, but there's lessons here for all countries. So I'm sure a lot of you are here because you know about this case broadly, but just, just for the Zoom and for the purposes of getting into the first clip, on the night of September 26, 2014, about 70 college students for the Normal Rural Burgos de Ayotzinapa were caravanning outside of a city in Guerrero called Iguala. They were commandeering buses. This is a practice in Mexico that dates back to the 20s, where local normales, rural agricultural schools that needed transportation would commandeer buses. Not a huge deal. It's not, it's sometimes, there might be rock throwing, things like that. But on this night led to a lot of bloodshed and it was a horrific night that ended in 46 people dead and 43 disappeared. Now, the first clip I wanted to play for you, and before I'll do that, is like, how do you tell this story for a US audience on the radio with no visuals? Now, Ayotzinapa is a story that's been told so much over the past 8 years by every major news outlet. It gained so much kind of international attention. And a lot of the reporting that happened at the get-go was about this night of the crime. The audio you're gonna hear, we can back into that, but the audio you're gonna hear is survivors of that night. So we really wanted to create not only an experience for the listener, but also a sense of depth around the night and to hear from the voices of those who experienced it kind of in their own words. Now, if you hear this on the podcast, you'll hear me kind of explaining a lot of it and kind of articulating. I tried to cut that out. The music doesn't work as well, but here you'll hear from two of the survivors whose names we've changed. But it's from audio that was taken in the days after the night of this crime. And I'm gonna do a little sound check too to make sure everyone in the back can hear. And let me back this up. And if not, I'll put the mic on it. And that should help. 3, 2, 1. No, see?
Then 2 or 3 police cars arrived, local police. They barricaded us, first from the front and then the back. They didn't warn us at all. They just got down and started shooting to kill. One of our compañeros tried to get out and do something to move the police cars, and that's when the first one of us was shot. I saw my compañero on the ground, lying in a pool of blood, convulsing, and the police just never stopped shooting. I was taking cover near a broken window. It was totally busted, but I could peek through. I saw 2 cops pointing at us, and then I saw a bunch of compañeros. They had already been arrested, but they continued to shoot, and all of us continued to shout.
To give you a sense of, these are recordings taken off of a little handheld mic that then, when you're making a podcast, you're then writing around this, trying to cast kind of actors or people that can match that voice to really bring this moment to kind of US listeners. But what happens is that you know, 43 of the boys from one of the buses are taken down. They're put in the backs of police trucks, and then they're taken away. And it's been 8 years, and it's still not clear what happened to them after that day, right? So, you know, the next kind of clip I want to set up and just talk through is that, you know, this happens, it makes huge news immediately. The press arrives immediately. It's 70 students, they all mobilize, and a night of terror kind of continues through the night. It's not just about the 43 disappeared. At that night, there's federal police, there's local police, there's military all around Iguala, basically with a sense of hunting the students, and for no particular reason at that moment. And then it ends at around 6 in the morning. You know, when we started to choose how to tell the story, you have basically 43 families that, you know, that yes, talk to the press and yes, talk to the media, but often find themselves in positions where if every year someone is going to come into your life or every month to ask you about your pain, you know, it becomes really hard to talk to the media, right? And then as reporters, as we're thinking about it, we're kind of trained. I don't know if there's any journalism students here, but I think often, especially in my generation, it's like the training is like you're taught how to go into people's lives and basically extract from them, right? And like the more you can bring back, let's say, tears for your editor or whatever, it's seen as, oh, you did your job, right? When you're working with people to document their lives and these experiences of trauma, that's something that we definitely didn't want to do. I partnered with a woman named Kate Doyle from the National Security Archive. And if there's any Latin Americanists in here, Kate Doyle is a woman that basically has used the FOIA, the transparency law, to petition the government around information of mass atrocities in Latin America. And through that work, she has helped bring down Rios Montt, basically in Guatemala, with the truth commissions over there, and El Salvador. So I was working with her to co-report this. And so just working with someone who very adamantly believes that you do not ask someone to tell their story about trauma unless it's absolutely pivotal or key to do that. So just to give you a sense, we went in this with this framing. And kind of in this problematic way, you know, you can't choose 43 families to get on public radio. And so we did choose, you know, we did end up having a report with a woman named Doña Cristina Bautista. She lost her son Benjamin at the time, and here she is telling us, and in voiceover, how she found out about this.
It's been more than 7 years since Nico and the other students were pulled out of those buses, and Cristina Ausencio sleeps in her son's room every single night. It's better this way, she tells me.
Benjamín Asensio Bautista es el cuarto de él.
This is his room.
De pasar mucho tiempo.
A long time had passed. I would see his room, and I felt like I couldn't go in. It made me sad and everything. And one day I made the decision
dormir en su cuarto,
to sleep in his room,
sentirlo más cerca a mi hijo,
to feel closer to him.
So every night she slips into his bed, imposing her loneliness onto his space. And every morning she leaves it, clothes, shoes, hair gel, exactly how he left it when he went to college in 2014. Once at the school, she stands under the archway at the entrance, hoping, praying that her son would be there, and run up to her.
And so I went up to one of the boys and I said,
Buenas tardes, muchacho. Le digo,
I came to visit my son. And he said, sí, tía. What's your son's name?
Benjamín Asensio Bautista.
And he said to me, tía,
su hijo está desaparecido con los demás compañeros, dice.
Your son disappeared with the other compañeros.
Pero no te preocupes, los estamos buscando, dice.
But don't worry, we're looking for them. We're going to find them.
Los vamos a encontrar.
But the students were not found that day or the next or the next.
Y ya, pues ahí empezó nuestro martirio.
Martirio. And that's when their martyrdom began.
Because I'm getting a message to leave webinar here, but I'll just let it be. Okay, I'll just let it be. So I don't know, Gaspar, if you want to prompt me with questions or I'm doing okay and I can just keep going. Go ahead. And then we can do Q&A. Okay, cool. So this is, the part that was edited out is that Doña Cristina is from a town called Alpuyacancingo de las Montañas, so way up in the mountains. So she didn't hear the news. This happened on a Friday. She didn't hear the news until Monday, until her brother was reading her the paper over the phone, right? So so once she gets to the school, they're basically, what ends up happening just from her perspective, and some of you might know the story, but just as we delve into like how you create kind of a narrative in a listener's mind that has never heard this story before, and through her lens, it's like they're basically told, they're thinking, okay, they took the buses, they commandeered their buses, they probably got arrested, they're safe with the cops. We're gonna go get them. They go to the police station, they're not there, they're not there, they're not there. And then very early on, I think the families, over and over, you talk to the families and you get the sense that something weird, something is off. They get, they get taken to, they get DNA samples taken from there in one place, like something is off, and they very quickly get lawyers because La Normal does have a huge history of organizing and activism, especially in the more leftist, kind of Marxist leftist vein in Mexico. There's a lot of, resources around getting lawyers immediately, and they immediately bring in what's called a precautionary measure, which is basically asking the UN and the Organization of American States to have a look here, to take a look, and they ask for independent investigators to come in. Now, the next thing I'm going to play you is they bring in the independent investigators from El Equipo Argentino de Forense, led by Mercedes Doretti, who has a deep history in like the dirty war and disappeared in Argentina, but that she's brought into this case to be like, okay, Mimi's gonna help us for the parents. She's gonna work with the government to help us figure out what happened, right? And so this is basically Mimi's perspective. Oh no, wait. The clip, oh, here it is, here it is. Okay, 1 second. And so this is, basically, they're taken to this garbage dump, right? So this is our illustration here. It was a team of women mostly, which is of note. And they're basically taken to this garbage dump and said, this is the Cocula garbage dump. We think something happened here. We got a tip, the government says, that something happened here. So she's there and they set up a perimeter and they're analyzing kind of what seems like could be remains, but maybe they're animal remains. They're getting a sense of the space when suddenly,
we're in this gigantic hall full of garbage, which is very weird, right? There was an entire wall of like 40 meters all full of garbage.
That's Mercedes Doretti, leader of the Argentine forensic team working for the parents of missing students.
One of the two federal prosecutors came to the garbage dump and said, you have to come to another place. And that's when we went, they took us to the Rio San Juan, where there was another completely different scene.
It's at a small river, and near the riverbank, there's already a Mexican forensics team well into their work. They're cleaning and laying out burnt remains on the ground. The remains were in a plastic garbage bag that had been pulled from the water.
They were coming out with fragments of bones. I remember very distinctly, I saw this fragment of bone that was very different from the rest because it was way bigger. And it was almost not burned. It immediately caught my attention. I thought, if in this bag there is more like this, we're going to be able to get DNA, and so we're going to know if these remains belong or not to the students.
And was there more like that?
No, that was the only one. They brought these two guys to the scene, detainees that they were holding from the neck like that. The face of the guy, I always remember that. He seemed absolutely terrorized. Looks like a kid. He was very, very young,
And there, in front of dozens of people, this man who looks like a kid starts shaking. And in a barely audible voice, he begins to confess to the crime.
We were in different cars. We brought the students up there to the garbage dump. We killed them. We burned them. This guy is incriminating himself.
One of Cerón's men turns to Mimi.
Doretti, ask questions. Am I authorized to interrogate someone? And I was like, no, I'm not going to, because I felt, I'm not sure if this is legal. And that's when I thought, is this torture here? For me, there was a red flag there.
This river where the bones are being laid out, from the get-go, her team is like, this is strange. Why weren't we here? Why weren't we brought in before? As she described, she picks out, it's all just very gruesome to describe too, where it's like, you know, when you end up learning what happened, but she picks out this bone. This bone is then taken to a DNA lab in Innsbruck. The bone ends up to be a match to a student named Alexander Mora Venancio. So as soon as this match is announced, then Murillo Karam, the Attorney General, with this other man, Tomás Cerón, the lead investigator on the case, hold a huge press conference and basically say, we have solved the case. We have effectively solved the case. What happened was that the students were taken, the cops took them to this garbage dump in Cocula. They handed them off to like local, you know, local kind of gangs, local police. And there they were shot by, this is where like it's these gruesome stories where it's like they shot them one by one, they throw them over a cliff and they burn 43 bodies through the night. And then those remains are then put in plastic garbage bags after 16 hours, which is strange if they're hot and remains put in plastic garbage bags. They're taken to a nearby river, which is El Rio San Juan. They're thrown into the river, and that last bag that had the remains of Alexander Mora, or one bone of Alexander Mora, like it, you know, apparently broke as they were throwing it, and that's why they were able to find a match. Basically, parents go home. The case has been solved. You need to let this go. So that was the initial theory. Of course, there's people like Mimi and her team who are just talking to the lawyers and being like, this is weird. All of this is very strange, right? So this is when the parents basically decide to demand a team of independent investigators to come in, which is known as the HIE. I would have a clip for you because you guys are kind of, now that I'm walking through this, that's a good clip in this context, which we didn't have for other events. But basically these team of 5 people, which is Francisco Cox from Chile, Claudia Paz y Paz from Guatemala, Carlos Beristain, who worked with the victims from Spain, and they're all put together by this man named Jim Cavallero, who's basically has this great Brooklyn accent, and he was kind of the mastermind of this, but it was a little bit of a fluke. And so they're brought in to basically investigate alongside with the Mexican government. What ends up happening is that they start to uncover so much, like, you know, these theories about why the buses, 5th bus versus 4th bus, could a fire have happened? They bring in fire experts who we interview for the podcast, who say that effectively a fire burning 43 people in the span of 16 hours was like not only implausible, it was scientifically impossible. There's satellite footage proving that night it was raining throughout the night. Like there's no way that a fire that big could happen. So what the government wanted to do was effectively close the case and underestimate the families, right? Be like, estos son campesinos, son indígenas, let's just shut them up and send them home. But what ends up happening is a true watershed moment in Mexico, right? Which is shortly after the crime, and this is an important thing of note. Now I've sped ahead, but an important thing of note is that before Mimi gets in, there's these mass graves that kind of appear on the outsides of Iguala, and the government immediately tells the parents, these are the students. Because Mimi had already been involved and she had already gotten DNA samples from all the families, they quickly realized that not only are they not the students, it's a whole other set of people, right? So this moment where it's not the students basically leads to what's called Los Otros de Iguala, where it's like basically citizens of Iguala set out to the mountains to poke the ground with sticks to find their loved ones. And until this very moment, you know, people ask why now? Why El Caso Ayotzinapa now? It's been 8 years, kind of, you know, there are other stories. But why now is because if Mexico cannot solve this case of 43 and now 100,000 people of forced disappearance, what can it solve? And this case leads people to be like, wait, these things that when I went to the cops and I was told, no, se fue para el otro lado, or she went with his girlfriend, or, you know, this thing of your son being disappeared or your daughter being disappeared, it's in your head. Suddenly it was a fact, an undeniable fact, that there were mass graves all around Iguala and especially Guerrero, but all around Mexico. So this movement of the parents knowing they're being lied to is taken to the city. And this, I'm going to play you El Fiscal first. Well, I don't know. This taken to the city. And our podcast basically delves into the perspective of this man named Omar Gómez Trejo, who then becomes El Fiscal Especial in recent years. But he's at the beginning kind of the secretary of this group of experts, right? He's just like coordinating their ticketing, and he makes his apartment their office and like basically becomes part of the team. And in that process, my co-reporter, Kate Doyle, is brought into this because, if you want to know anything about human rights in Latin America, you kind of end up crossing Kate Doyle. And she initially, her question is like, why the ferocity of the attack? Okay, we know that students commandeer buses. We know that maybe they'll get arrested, but why disappear? Why kill? Why the federal government walking around that day? Why the military covering around that day? Why? And so in answering this question, this is what her and I, and mostly her, come up with.
I got pulled in when the lawyers for the families contacted me. There was a really intriguing lead in the case that the Mexican government had just ignored. And it came from a drug investigation in Chicago, of all places. Here's what happened. At the end of 2014, not long after the attack on the students, the U.S. Justice Department posted a press release announcing a drug bust. It said 8 men had been charged as a part of a heroin trafficking ring operating out of Aurora, a Chicago suburb. According to the DEA, the men were working for a Mexican drug cartel called Guerreros Unidos. That's the same gang Mexican officials were saying was involved in the disappearance of the 43 students in Iguala, Mexico. When the lawyers called, my first move was to track down this man.
My name is Mark Giuffre. It's Giuffre for the record. I'm a retired special agent with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration.
The DEA had intercepted thousands of text messages sent between the drug dealers in Aurora and their suppliers in Iguala.
We were intercepting conversations, it being unloaded, yet we're unloading it right now. When they were talking about the code name they used for heroin.
Wait, what was the code word for heroin?
I can't remember what they used in this
Okay,
case.
in the court document they say, is your aunt arriving tonight?
Yeah, I think the ants were the buses, but so we knew from the codes they were using that heroin loads were coming up in buses and that bulk cash, millions and millions of dollars, was going back down via the same method. We looked at our data, our intelligence, the intercepts. More than 2,000 kilograms of heroin came to Chicago in a 1-year period of time, which is a unprecedented, mind-boggling amount.
The heroin was hidden behind the bumpers of the buses. Mark connected the dots between Guerreros Unidos' buses and the Ayotzinapa students.
These students hijacked the wrong bus. They hijacked the wrong bus. To me, it was just so crystal clear that if not for that being the bus they hijacked, my hypothesis is they might all very well be alive today.
So that's Mark Giuffre, who was literally surveilling Guerreros Unidos during the same time, but working kind of in parallel. No idea that this had any links to Ayotzinapa. He then opens Time magazine to read about the Verdad Histórica, this theory of the garbage dump, and that's where he starts connecting the dots, but he's just a foot soldier. He doesn't really say anything. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the investigation continues. Omar, who I talked about, who will then become the special prosecutor, continues being the secretary of the 5 experts, and they start to question these buses, right? All the survivors you heard from in the first clip say that there were 5 buses. They took 5 buses. Yet the whole time the government was touting it was only 4 buses. And this seems like it's in the weeds, but these independent investigators were like, where is the 5th bus? And there's this whole back and forth of they present them with a bus, it ends up being a fake bus. Total, this idea of the fifth bus theory, by the time the experts leave in 2015, about a year and a half later, is just like a red herring. It's like a conspiracy theory. I don't know if any of you remember, it was like el quinto autobús. And it becomes kind of a conspiracy theory to even talk about this in Mexico. But from the perspective of kind of the international investigators, not really investigating the crime, but they end up investigating what we now know was a cover-up on the part of the Peña Nieto administration about what happened. For this, they get kicked out of Mexico, they all leave, their mandate ends, and Omar ends up in Washington, D.C., which is when him and Kate Doyle meet up. You know, we go through it in the podcast at this point. So initially, when we meet Omar Gomez Trejo, you know, Kate reaches out to me and she's like, let's do a documentary on this for the radio. We had worked together on a story about 1968, the October 2nd massacre in Mexico City. So it was like an easy fit. She says, I have an insider who worked with the experts. He can be like a great interview and we'll tell the story about, you know, this, you know, a story about what happened in the past, but we'll tell the story of the investigation, which is a version that no one had told about Ayotzinapa. So it was still a story a little bit in the past, but then what happens in 2018 into 2019 is that a new government starts in Mexico, right? The government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador coming in with like this moment of hope for Mexico. Andrés Manuel basically campaigns with the parents of the 43, promising not only to reopen the case, but to find out what happened to their boys. And so as we're like, you know, kind of documenting this from afar, we're already recording, you know, we're trying to figure out how to get to Mark Dufresne, this DEA agent. It turns out that he chooses Omar Gomez Trejo to lead this new investigation as the special prosecutor. So just, you know, as you think about how this work is done, if anyone wants to do this work in this room, it's like suddenly your source, your main source becomes, can't talk to you anymore because he's now in the middle of an investigation. This is early 2020. You know, Kate and I go to Mexico, we chat with him, and we come to an agreement where he basically says, I will tell you about everything that happens up until the new investigation, but you have to take me out of Mexico. By this time, they had been like surveilled, and Pegasus was used on not only the experts, but the parents. Like it had just been a very insecure moment in Mexico until AMLO was sworn in. Even then, he didn't feel like he could talk safely about what happened. What ends up happening after that is the pandemic, right? And shutdown and lockdown. So it's like, not only can we not interview him face to face by bringing him to Berkeley or LA or New York City into a studio, we can't, you know, he's not going to go on a Zoom to talk to us. So we end up mailing him a reporter, right? And so suddenly we go from like telling a story that happened in the past, which is fine and good, and a story that a US audience needs to learn because all of us here have a sense for it. But also we had this idea, like, we're going to tell you this, like no one can tell it to you, the story of the investigation. Well, suddenly it became like a developing story, like it was happening as we were reporting on it. And here you'll hear from Al Letson, who's our host of the podcast, and and we kind of break down a little bit our relationship with Omar el Fiscal.
In June 2019, Omar Gomez Trejo is sworn in as a chief prosecutor for Caso Ayotzinapa, the case of the 43 missing students. It's big news in Mexico.
Omar Gómez Trejo, maestro en derechos humanos.
Trejo fue secretario ejecutivo.
Omar Gómez Trejo como fiscal especial para el caso Ayotzinapa.
A few months into his new position, Omar reconnects with Kate Doyle and starts communicating on a regular basis with her and Anayansi Diaz-Cortes, sharing his insider's perspective on what it's like to lead this case. On trips to Mexico, they meet him in person, usually at his home.
Hola. ¿Qué tal?
As special prosecutor, Omar now has the power to indict government officials who he suspects sabotaged the original investigation. He can follow up on leads that could expose who the attackers were and what they did with the students. During their visit, Omar and his wife Helen tell Anayansi and Kate that doing this job means adjusting almost every aspect of their daily life to keep them safe.
There are phones in the fridge.
Helen, why do you make DJ put his phone in the fridge?
Because the fridge doesn't block the signal, but it does block the mic. That's what Edward Snowden taught us like 10 years ago.
Is your phone in the fridge, DJ?
Ahí vive, todo el tiempo.
It lives there, Omar tells me.
Porque le gusta que su teléfono esté fresco.
He likes the phone to be fresh.
O sea, yo parto de que siempre me están escuchando, incluso ahora.
I always assume that people are listening in on me, even now, without a cell phone.
Omar says his early days as prosecutor are brutal because the prosecutor's office, known as the Fiscalía, is filled with many of the same people who had hidden the truth about the case. He says one day he was given a file with some very sensitive information about people who worked for the previous administration.
Yo dejo mi file en la mesa. I put the file on my desk, and at one point I get up and go talk to someone in the office about something. And when I come back, the file isn't there.
He goes to building security, and they get the surveillance video. It shows someone from his staff entering his office, picking up the folder, and walking out with it.
Después voy, lo confronto. And so I go to him, I confront him.
Niega la información.
He denies it. And my folder is sitting right there in his desk. I grab my file, go talk to his superiors. They don't want to do anything about it. That's when I realize I have to take much more drastic measures. And I begin firing people.
By the time he's finished cleaning house, Omar has fired most of the people working in his department. Dozens of them.
To give you a sense of, what Omar was faced with, and that file that he's talking about, we can now set. We call him DJ. That's why it's like DJ that's not set up. I cut that out, but we end up calling him DJ over time because nos mandaba mezclas. And then Helen is American. She's an American from Texas, and she kind of became low-key our producer there. We trained her, and they would record diary entries. They would record overnight. They would record cooking, and it ended up being a way to bring listeners kind of into the life, into a more human version of what a prosecutor is. Now, this file he was talking about is a file, if you remember from that second clip with Mimi Doretti, talking about torture, right? So when they talk about Mexico and the judicial system, there's a lot of talk in recent years about la tortura es generalizada, like torture is a strategy of investigation. It's a method of investigation that is just taught, right? So in this new investigation, one of the things that Omar and his team, he brings back the experts as well, is like, we will not torture anybody, right? Which is a low bar, but also a huge thing in Mexico. And so when Mimi's talking about torture in that first scene in 2014, fast forward almost 5 years later, every single person who was charged for that crime was tortured over time, many times by the attorney, with the attorney general in the room present. So a lot of Omar's work goes from like figuring out what happened that night 6.5 years later, like basically opening a cold case, but also figuring out the cover-up and why the cover-up. So the next clip I want to play you is actually back, he has this file, and that file has the stories of people that confessed to this crime, and basically this was the nature of their confessions. This is a man, just to set it up a little bit, this is a man named Carlos Canto. We went to great lengths to interview him over time. We spoke with his sister, we spoke with his UN representatives because he's under custody and he was protected. We were the first people he spoke to about what happened to him in the days after the crime. You'd get a sense for his full story. It's very hard to listen to in many points, but he's a very compelling person. He was a teacher in Iguala. He owned a bar where some of the Guerreros Unidos went there, and that's why he was targeted. But he was basically a middle school teacher with the same last name as the same pseudonym. They called him El Pato, the same pseudonym, and he was then, this was his story.
Y afortunadamente,
Fortunately,
creo en Dios.
I believe in God.
Pues yo creo que lo buscamos en los
I think you seek Him out in your darkest times.
encontrarlo. Me pongo a rezar, ¿no? Me pongo a rezar y a pedirle a Dios.
I begin to pray to ask God,
¿Por qué ya me olvidaste? ¿O por qué te alejaste de mí?
what about me? Why did you forget me?
yo creo que lo pedí con tanta...
I think I asked him with such passion that only 2 or 3 days passed when I heard someone shout,
Profe, ay, que salió un video de tu tortura.
"Teacher, a video of your torture was leaked and it's on the
No
news."
estás jugando con eso, le digo.
And I'm like, nah, don't mess around.
Sí, profe, en serio, que salió un video de tu tortura.
Yes, profe.
Te estaban torturando y lo...
A video of your torture came out and we saw a part of it.
Sí, efectivamente, escuché la...
And yes, it was true. They turned on the TV and during the news break,
En el video,
there it was.
según el expediente del caso Ayotzinapa, Carlos Canto fue detenido el 22 de octubre.
Sentí un alivio.
I felt such a sense of relief and I gave thanks to God.
Y aquí estás.
Here you are.
Carlos is set free and put on a bus home. He manages to buy a cell phone to call his family. And during the bus ride, he decides to Google his name. This next part is hard to listen to.
Y busqué por internet, ¿no?
I went online to look for the video. I said, I'm gonna watch it. When I finally watched it, oof.
Que todo se te cierra, que te falta el aire.
I felt like everything was closing. I struggled to breathe.
Yo creo que sí, yo creo que hasta lloré.
I think I even cried on the bus the first time I saw what they were doing to me.
Basically, in the days after that happened, the Marines show up at his house and take him a un terreno baldío to a lot, and over many hours, he's basically experiences torture, and then taken to Mexico City, experiences more torture, and is basically forced to sign a confession. He declares that he's been tortured for 5 years. He stays in jail for 5 years with his lawyers advocating for him, and then them denying his release until this YouTube video is leaked. So Omar is then untangling. There's over 40 videos that he then finds because the people from the Peña Nieto administration, namely this man named Tomás Cerón, was kind of obsessed with documenting everything. So there's a wealth of kind of video archival that he did of the entire cover-up as it is. So, 8 years now, we effectively can say, even when I was starting to work on this, we couldn't say it was a cover-up. It was an alleged cover-up. We now know that everything about this garbage dump theory and what happened to them was a lie made up by the Peña Nieto administration. Yeah, we can get into the theories about what really happened or not and where the case is now, but I'll save that for after. I think now I just want to leave room for Gaspar to come in, and I want to just ground us a little bit more in like what's really important, which is the families, and in this case, Doña Cristina. So Doña Cristina, the next clip I'm going to play makes me a little cringy because there's so much explaining that's happening, but just to get, I'm in a safe space, so I can tell you and all of you here is that Doña Cristina invites us to her house in Alpuyacancingo de las Montañas during Todos Santos, during what we know here as Day of the Dead, or in Mexico as Day of the Dead, for that time. And now as kind of a reporter of a story like this, you always, in radio, there's this saying where you need, you want to show people, not tell them, right? And how do you show an audience, or is that even possible, the experience of living with someone who's been forcibly disappeared, right? So in this context of going to her house, she's a single mom with 2 daughters, so it's a house of women, which I thought was very interesting because a lot of this movement is kind of because of La Normal, and it's a boys' school. It has a very kind of macho tone, the kind of messaging around it. So I really found her family's perspective so different in this way, and much more intimate as to their relationship to their son Benjamin. And so Benjamin had 2 sisters, one older, one younger, Laura and Meirani. And I want to play this clip because it really talks about how even within one family, when a person has been forcibly disappeared and there is no truth and there is no justice and there are no remains and there is no person coming home, there's this sense of limbo where we can, each member of the family has their own theories about what happened. And that kind of state of lack of truth leads to that. So here is, hopefully you'll get to know Benjamin a little bit through his sisters, and here's a clip of that time. It's Kate Doyle and I in El Puyacancingo de las Montañas with Meirani and Laura.
We talk about the family. I learned that Laura helped raise her little brother Benjamin when her mom went to the US to work for a few years. The family needed the money for basic things like firewood and grain. It was hell, Laura says. Benja cried a lot as a baby, and she had to console him. As he grew up, he was different from most boys in the village. He was self-confident and fashionable. Meirani says he was the only kid in town who dared to wear pink. And he was a super talented dancer. When Laura got married, Benja walked her to the church. In this video, you see them dancing together. Benja in a pink button-down shirt. He always hugged me, even though she's not a hugger, and never hugged him back. He's alive. He's going to return. I can tell her younger sister Meirani doesn't see things that way, but she doesn't say anything. It's midnight when the dead are supposed to come to feast. The dogs know, Christy and her daughters tell me. They can see the spirits, and they're welcoming them.
So yeah, that was meant to just illustrate in this moment. If you see here, Benjamin it seems like he's on the altar, but he's not supposed to be on the altar. And there's this moment between Laura and Doña Cristi, and donde, Cristina wants to put him on the altar por si acaso, and Laura es que estás diciendo que estás muerto? Are you saying he's dead? So it's just a way to kind of illustrate what it can be like, even in these simple moments of setting out an altar and not knowing what the truth is and what that can mean. I want to play you a final clip, and then we can go on to questions, because I feel like I've talked, but you'll also notice that I try to avoid voiceover, which ends up meaning that you translate, but just to put in your brain, the storytellers out there of how to convey storytelling and how to bring up your sources' voices to the forefront, even if it's not in English for a US audience. And sadly, in radio, there are no subtitles. So these are things we have to think about. The last thing I'll play you is Doña Cristi, and about this dream she told us about the day before we left.
The next day, before we leave, Kate and I sit down with Doña Cristi in Benjamin's room and struggle to pose our questions. She tells Kate and me about a dream she had.
Estaba en una ciudad, edificios grandes.
In a grand city, there's this house with an open door, and she walks in. A woman in a rebozo, a shawl, greets her.
Le quiero pedir un favor ahorita. Le digo así, ¿de qué?
I want to ask you for a favor. In the middle of the room, there's someone sleeping who's covered with a blanket. She tells me they left me to take care of him.
Me dejaron cuidando acá. ¿Quién sería que no tiene memoria?
He lost his memory. Can you watch him?
Sí, sí.
Yes. Who is it?
Ya se levantó.
Then he gets up. My son.
Mi hijo. Me dice, mami, escuché tu voz, dice. Me encontraste.
You found me. Look at how they hit me.
Como me golpearon, por eso estoy fingiendo que no tengo memoria.
That's why I'm pretending I can't remember.
Pero escuché tu voz, mami.
But I heard your voice, Mommy, and I just hugged him.
Y que le dio, ay, papacito, yo que lo abracé. Digo, no, venga, vamos.
And I tell him, Benja, let's go. But when I turned back to him,
desperté.
I woke up and didn't see him. But for a moment, I felt joy. I got to see my son.
Desperté, ya no lo miré. Digo, ay, pero me alegré un ratito que sí lo vi mi hijo.
Well, thank you for clapping, despite the fact that this is such a wrenching story. Thank you, Anayansi, for producing this. And I really recommend to everybody to listen to the 7-episode podcast because you really get into it and you really hear the voices. And before I open it up for questions from the audience, because I'm sure a lot of you have been following this case, for me, I learned a lot after listening to the episodes, and also I have still a lot of questions. But one of the questions that I'm curious is your engagement with the actors, right? And I wonder if you can give us an update on some of these actors, the families who did disappear after, close to 9 years, and the case has been unresolved. The other actor is that there's a new administration, and they came in with the promise of solving the crime. Actually, that was part of the political campaign. And they sort of issue a report and then sort of disappear. And also, there are the members of the government from past and the current government who are in exile, who cannot be in Mexico. So that is interesting, right? Omar is here in the United States. The guy who was in charge, the prosecutor, is now in exile in Israel. And actually, there's a lot of news about how he uses spyware on everybody. So just if you can just give us a little update about the lives of these people that share their experience, their tears with you. Are you keeping in touch with them? What is happening with that?
Yeah, if we were better resourced, we would have brought Christy or Laura Meirani to speak here today. But we have, so where our podcast ends, it ends with basically Omar being kind of a hero. He's going to find truth and justice. There was another boy that was two more, Josivani and Cristian Alfonso Rodriguez Telumbre were found. Their remains were found in this place called, of all names, La Barranca y la Carniceria. And he figured out that they were there. Omar starts to really source people from people that were there that night, from people in the cartel, and they do match. They match to two students. So there have been two more students. In the meantime, so that's covered in our podcast. And we kind of leave it there, which was now 2021, end of 2021. And then since then, this past year, the same group of experts that I was telling you about, the HIE, they come back in and they basically go into the military archives, right? So they're digging into the military archives. Andres Manuel allows this to happen at the time. And they find this drone footage that is, we did an update on our podcast, but we're going to continue to cover it and bring you exactly what happened, because what ends up, they find this drone footage of the Cocula garbage dump of hours before Mimi, who we heard from, was brought in. There was a whole kind of, a whole set of actors of the federal police, of the military drones, basically doctoring that site before Mimi's arrival, putting out a fire, putting out a thing. So now we know that was completely covered up by Murillo Karam, the Attorney General, Tomás Herón, who's in Israel, who was the head of the equivalent of the FBI and the CI of the AIG. He was the head of everything and the lead investigator on this case. And now we know the mastermind of the cover-up. As soon as Omar was sworn in, he leaves to Canada, then Israel, which is where he is now. There's an Interpol notice to try to get him extradited back to Mexico, but I think that has been really hard. So you know, by last year, March, April, it's like it's looking up, right? The military seems to be involved in the cover-up and the crime. Omar starts to really push the DEA for those text messages. So alongside, you know, telling the government to basically use this thing called the MLAT, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, to get information from different governments that would benefit different cases, in this case, Ayotzinapa, from the US government. The US was saying, no, we're not gonna give you anything. I mean, I like to credit the podcast, but who knows? But Omar does say that the people at the DA did listen to the podcast. Obviously, Mark Giuffre was featured, which is a retired special agent. And shortly after, he is given a wealth of information that basically talks about this route from Iguala to Aurora, Illinois, and the people involved in that route. We have not seen those documents. Those are, you know, it was given to him as a government at some point. They ask us, you know, even the interview with Mark Giuffre, to be part of Omar's criminal investigation. So it really starts to seem like things are moving forward until this summer, where basically the government issues a report named the Kovac report, which is very insider baseball. It basically features a bunch of, you can find it online, it features a bunch of redacted text messages saying what happened to the students. Nobody from Omar's team knew about this report, nor were they alerted. And, you know, the indictment, there were 20 indictments put out against military officials by Omar's office. Those were then rescinded very quickly on. And then there was an arrest of Murillo Karam, the then Attorney General, which you might have heard of at the time. He's now, I think he's in custody or is gonna be released, but it felt unfounded, and it kind of, Omar's team was taken aback by this. Now, this is all in a context where Andrés Manuel López Obrador, for all the good things he may or may not have done, he's now militarizing Mexico effectively and kind of siding on that side. So you have Omar's team and the group of international experts digging into the military, and then suddenly a second version of what happened before happens, where the case is shut down. This Kovac report is seen as like the official report of what happened. The HIE, the international experts in Omar's office, say that the text messages and evidence in that report have also been doctored, but that they have to leave. The mandate ends. Omar is currently in Washington, DC. He left in September, around the 8th anniversary. The HIE gives a final press conference, these group of international experts saying, kind of, you know, telling AMLO that he wronged Omar and his team by doing this, and they leave. So now we're kind of in this part 2 of this case, where after now 8 and change years, the parents are kind of not, you know, this whole time they've been saying it was the state, it was the state, it was the state. Yes, they were told, yes, it was the state who did this, but to someone like Cristina, she's like, okay, te llevo diciendo, I've been saying this for 8 years. Thank you so much. Thank you for nothing. We've known it was the state. But in terms of what they say, el paradero de los estudiantes, what happened minute to minute after they were taken, there's no official truth till this day. And, you know, Omar's team was basically broken up. Some people did stay, but he is now out. And we're kind of in this new territory again, where this new government wants to close the case and move on. The parents don't have real answers, you know, except for the parents of Christian, who in the podcast, we talked to Christian's mother. They found, you know, Omar's team found a piece of his foot. And even in that context, Doña Luzma says you can live without a foot. So there is no sense of closure for the parents, and kind of it continues. Doña Cristina's daughters are now in Bridgeport, Connecticut currently. They live there now, and Omar is in Washington, DC. It's a sad time for the case, yeah.
I'm gonna, before opening it up for questions, the other important detail that you outlined in the podcast is, one of the questions that you started this presentation was, why so much violence? Why disappearing 43 students, and why this? And you mentioned that the most current hypothesis is that the students commandeered the wrong buses, that was linked to Guerreros Unidos. And there's a whole book by a reporter who actually wrote about that. Is that for you? Does that explain it? Is that how do you, after reporting on this, is that hypothesis holding in terms of explaining the why of this disappearance?
You know, after doing this, we're like, okay, we're done. Omar is going to solve the case and we can move on. But with the current state of the case, we're working on a season 2 to kind of exactly dig into those DA documents that were handed and how we can FOIA from them on the US side to demand to get those documents to effectively show what that route means and to try to see if that was what holds, that they did commandeer the wrong bus. But what is true is that Guerreros Unidos is known to disappear, and Guerreros Unidos controls that whole, or at the time controlled that whole area. It gets very complicated because Guerreros Unidos is also divided. It's now fractured, but at the time it was fractured into the part from Guerrero and the part from Estado de Mexico, which happens to be where the then president was from. So there's a lot of intrigue around this bus, this drug route. There's 7 people indicted from Guerreros Unidos, including Pablo Vega, one of the founders of Guerreros Unidos in Chicago. We want to interview him, or at least his lawyers, and try to really dig onto what we can tell on the US side was happening, because we've got no information. Right now, Kate Doyle is working on a big piece around the secrecy, the US secrecy around this case, and not really understanding why. And, in some way, this also leads into Cienfuegos, who was then the defense minister, who was, arrested in LA and then released, and who is on the record over and over in 2014 saying, "You will not interview my soldiers. These parents need to go home." So it's really like the web of corruption and impunity, and yet once again, this case is being shut down, and it relies on people in like nonprofit newsrooms to kind of dig, and people like us to ask to figure this out, but it's kind of where it is.
I have to pass the microphone so that everybody can hear. People ask First of all, I just want to congratulate you. Amazing. There's human elements of this. This is a story about humans that was here. And I think the access that you got in the podcast was very unique to other podcasts that I've listened to in general. So I just want to congratulate you. I'm really interested in this surveillance and the surveillance techniques and what the government was using to surveil. And then also, I think, we're all aware that it's extremely difficult to conduct real, authentic journalism in Mexico. Journalism is an extremely dangerous job to perform in Mexico. So I have 2 questions. One is, has there been any reports of surveillance within the new administration, new diggings into what has happened with the AMLO seemed very, welcoming to this, and that they were going to solve this case. But now that people are starting to dig a little bit further, has there been any more reports of the use of Pegasus, or any more reports of surveillance in general? And then, also, did you or your colleagues suffer any, types of interference, let's say, from the government or from other municipal actors? And then the other last question that I have is, the access that you got in this podcast is so amazing. And I'm just curious. It's obviously made for a U.S. audience, but then is there like a desire to then make this very accessible for the Mexican audience and for Mexico in general? Or are there podcasts that already exist in Mexico that highlight all of this? But I feel like the access that you have, it's so important for these stories to also be, accessible. And so that kind of.
So I'll start from the bottom because now that you asked. So we did partner with a Spanish language production company called Adonde Media, and this kind of feeds into your other question about security and such, because we, initially we wanted to only do the podcast in Spanish because that's where it mattered, but just the way podcasting is in Mexico, it didn't make sense. So we did a bunch of our reporting. We got it greenlit in English, and we did it for Reveal, right? Then we started to work with two very badass journalists named Olivia Cerón and Inger Diaz-Barriga, who was more the producer, to make this, Después de Ayotzinapa, which is a 7-part series in Spanish, using our tape and our structure, and we kind of collaborated to make that happen. And I think when you talk about kind of security, especially with this case, because it really is such a privileged case. When you think of the 100,000, it has all the elements where it has an international spotlight. We're talking about it at UCLA. It has reporters on all over the world and in the US covering it. We were following Omar, so that allows for a kind of bubble, right? And so it's almost like whether we were secure or not wasn't as important as keeping our sources secure and seeing it from the perspective of the families and their security, so that it's almost like you kind of have to put it in a drawer and then be like, maybe we are being surveilled or maybe not, and then take measures like with Omar. We would only communicate very briefly on Signal. Whenever he would send us tape, we would use Onion, these encrypted softwares. We would only meet in person. Even now, when we met now in Cal Berkeley, he was over there. We found ourselves whispering to each other. But I think that privilege kind of protected us. And the families will even talk about them because they're Ayotzinapa parents. They're kind of protected even within the context of Guerrero in some ways. So when we think about what it means to cover the other 100,000, right? And how this case is what they call a paradigmatic case, which is a case from which to view all cases of forced disappearance. And in terms of surveillance, yes, there was the Pegasus software, which it was this man Tomás Cerón who basically brokered the contract with Israel and the Mexican government to be able to surveil through Pegasus. Definitely not like los narcotraficantes, but the human rights workers, journalists, the parents themselves, Omar, Doña Cristi herself was surveilled over time through Pegasus. Now, with these Guacamaya leaks recently, I don't know how much you've heard or not, around this summer, these leaks get dropped that now have shown that the military, that AMLO has used a different version of Pegasus to surveil, from the military to surveil other actors. And within, Kate at the National Security Archive, and she's now weeding through, it's an insane amount of documents, and it's impossible to tell, but we're literally creating a database to see every time Ayotzinapa is mentioned, every time Iguala is mentioned, and what she's seen effectively, or what we've seen effectively now, even in this early stage, is that Ayotzinapa was being surveilled, years before what the parents have said, years before 2014, the whole night, the movement of the buses, those 2 weeks before, during, and after they were being surveilled. There's also messages from the different parts of the military saying, that man, Martinez Crespo, who you want to arrest, he's a good man, just like the military constantly advocating for their people. And that's all a part of these leaks. But to answer your question briefly, I think yes, the Andrés Manuel López Obrador administration has been surveilling people as well through the military, which is even maybe just as disturbing or more. And then your other question, I think I answered everything. The government interference, the surveillance, and our own safety. We got to go back to the US after every visit. And so just remembering that, and then me remembering that I could not be more distant from Doña Cristi, a woman with a son who's been forcibly disappeared, indigenous from Alpuyacancingo, but I was her representative in a room full of editors, one from Boston, one from Salt Lake City, trying to convince and advocate. So just kind of addressing our power and privilege in that, and then kind of honoring that access, as you say. not only, you know, of course, with the families, but also with someone like Mimi. I mean, we flew to Chicago to meet with Mimi. I think there was always this sense, just to answer your question on surveillance, of like on the record, off the record, in person, not in person. And within the context of the pandemic, initially it made it more difficult because people were so distant, but it actually helped because we were kind of protected by distance, and then people had time to talk to us for like hours and hours and hours where they wouldn't have ordinarily had time. So it was one of those cases where like the story kind of wanted to be told. And I think all of us were ready to move on. And now with everything that happened in the summer, I don't think we can.
That in the podcast, you give context of the school, something that is often left out in the discussion. For example, in the Netflix show, I think. It seems important to me what the school represents. The only position for Guerrero's youth. Do you think that it played a role in the outrage in Mexico that the students were from this particular? And another question from Ruben Hernandez. He's saying, thank you for your presentation. This was if this was a cover up on the part of the government, what were they trying to cover up? Who were they trying to cover up or project, and why? So questions from the people online.
Thank you, Gaspar. To answer Evelyn's question, thank you. Yeah, one thing I didn't mention that I should just really mention is that this journalist, John Gibler, he's an American journalist who had covered Las Normales for years now, in the days after the attack, just got on a bus and went to record all the survivors, all the families, and his initial interviews, those interviews that you hear in the podcast, I mean, there are hours and hours of tape. He was generous enough to share that with us, really were the forensic map for the investigations that followed and laid the groundwork for, there were 5 buses, for just the whole thing of how it happened. And I think why it was important that it was, you know, John, and like setting forth, you know, the students in La Normal are very wary of the government, the press. You know, it was good that they talked to John because it was someone that they knew and trusted. And the reason for this is because it's, you know, namely rural indigenous communities. They train to be teachers to then go back to their communities and teach, and of like leftist, Marxist, Maoist, you know, training and thinking. So, you know, what that means in, you know, 2023 is that in Guerrero, they're obviously, you know, seen as kind of a nuisance to the government and seen kind of this kind of expendable aspect. So for a while when covering the story, before like the buses and the drug cartel, it's like there was this sense of like, why did they just invent this story and cover it up? It's porque sentían que podían, no? It's like because they thought they could, and because they underestimated, I think, these specific students from La Normal and their families. Because one thing that these students from La Normal know, I'm getting a feedback, is how to organize. Thank you, Ari. I'll go on to the, okay, test 1, 2, test 1, 2. Okay, cool. Is really just how to organize, right? So it wasn't just any community. It was like they bound together, they got lawyers, they reached out to the UN. They were organizers and activists and knew how to advocate for themselves and understood fire and understood the land and understood it was the state and understood their role within the context of the local government, the state government, and the federal government, and their role as kind of activists and teachers. So I think on the part of the Peña Nieto administration, it was just a little bit like, let's just sweep them under, it was racism and classism and this idea of like los de izquierda just like expendable, being expendable. And they really thought that they could just get away with it. Se les hizo fácil, como dicen en Mexico, no? They thought it would be just easy, but what ends up happening is that La Chinoya, which is their lawyers in Guerrero, and then Centro Pro in the city, which is the Centro de Derechos Humanos in Mexico City, that's when they really galvanize to bring in kind of a more global light here. But not, you know, that's what also makes it a case of privilege. But it was really these families knowing how to organize and being in that context radical, right? And radical, teachers, maestros. And so that was what they underestimated. That, these are educated families at the end of the day, and very much experienced in organizing and taking it to the state level, to the city level. And in the first month, having marches, like huge marches in Mexico City around forced disappearance. And even till this day, like they are leading these marches of hundreds and thousands of people looking for their families, or marching in the city. So I think that's why they were undermined. And then why the cover up? I think that might have answered it. I think also, in telling the story initially, we were like, did they just do it because they thought they could, and they were already a nuisance, and why not have the ferocity of the attack? But I think as you start to look into Anabel Hernandez's book, who talks about the fifth bus and the military, and you start to see, Mark Dufresne surveilling in Guerreros Unidos in Aurora and Chicago, and you start to see that it wasn't just like these local gang members that decided to do this, but really a transnational drug cartel. You start to see why it matters to cover this up. And what we don't know yet is like how high up it goes. Like initially it was like, oh, the military was just standing around that night, because there is a battalion, the 27th Battalion in Iguala. They were just part of it, just standing around. Now we know, that they were part of the cover up and likely, involved in the crime. And to what point is still unclear. And, in my personal point of view, this is why for the Andrés Manuel López Obrador government, it became easier to just hand off a report, tell Omar to just, and his team to just like go away and move on with like his kind of partnership with the military at this point.
Give you the microphone. Everybody on my Thank you for having listened to the podcast. In Mexico, there's a history. Teachers and students, in particular, the teaching Guerrero, the history of the association between escuelas rurales and teachers and guerrilla. It's sort of part of the military history of the region. So I wonder just kind of how that history played a role in kind of and the reaction to violence, cover up at this particular type of student. It was not regular students. Just curious.
And maybe Gaspar, you can answer some of that, but yeah, I think it's.
This an under-realized strategy.
I mean, I think that's that, when you look at the Guacamaya leaks or even the military archives, what's clear is that they are so consistently, there's like no resources going into these schools for like electricity or, a sense of, even beds, kids are sleeping on the floor and, not even unos catres, but they were deeply surveilled. I mean, for years now, and then deeply surveilled through the days before, during the attack, after the attack. So they are seen. I mean, that was the excuse, right? Estos son unos guerrilleros, son unos comunistas. That was kind of the excuse. And then some of them are narcs. So initially it was, the campaign on the part of the government was like, son guerrilleros comunistas, and they're colluding with the cartels, y son narcotraficantes. And now what we've learned now too is that one of the students was actually he was from the military. One of the kids that disappeared was like implanted. He was a spy within there. So it's like they were expendable for the reasons that you mentioned, I think, in the eyes of the government, but for that same reason, they were underestimated as well.
Not participating This computer right here. So this is Jose Luis Figueroa from DigniCraft. Congratulations with the presentation, amazing investigative and storytelling. What is the position of the families to the Ayotzinapa incidents with the state of the case today?
That's an interesting question because, yeah, it's hard to every single month they march, they go to the to the Capitol. But talking to Doña Cristina, who I talked to, and Doña Luzma, who we talked to for the podcast, there's a sense that there's a lot of divides coming in currently. And, what helped them get to where they are is that they stayed united and they were a united front, even though there was so many attempts to kind of break them apart and basically break them apart. So Doña Cristi was telling me that in the last month, it was like 5 parents or 6 parents, then 14. So there is this sense of like they're tiring them out. And then another thing that becomes a true kind of divide amongst the parents is that some of them still want to look in real life. They want to figure out if their sons are still alive. And so when you have a case of forced disappearance, the reason we don't say that they were, they're dead, because they're not. Until you have remains, you speak about it in present tense, right? Until you know the truth, like Doña Cristi says, díganme dónde llorar, tell me where to cry, which is something that keeps her going and going. So a lot of parents are looking for their sons in vida, as they say in living, when at the same time it contradicts kind of the perspective of their lawyers and of Omar, who say that there's no evidence that is still the case because of the way forced disappearance happens in Guerrero, because of the patterns. And so you have this kind of confusion and divide happening. And when they're not in line with the government, and a lot of disappointment with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, from what we can tell, it's kind of in this very slow time right now where like nobody knows what's going to happen, and they're kind of waiting for the next election. But I'm looking forward to going to Mexico in the coming months and report back. It's hard to tell from here, and that's part of like our job in this room too, whether it's academic or from our different disciplines, is how to not like parachute in and then come back and kind of become a voice for this, but really continue to stay on the ground, to have perspective, right? And I feel like even though I haven't been there in 2 months, I don't have the sense. I was there in September when Omar resigned, and there wasn't 43 parents there. There was only 13 or 15. I think now with the anniversary, the 8th anniversary, there was more. But it's like, how do you keep it going after 8 years? I think is a huge challenge, and keep the case in the press and in the limelight.